out of the water! Get back on the boat! Oh, fuck you, John. Alright everyone, hello and welcome to a new episode of the Screenplay Archaeology podcast. I'm your host KiramidHead, and tonight I'm going to be looking at the remaining Creature from the Black Lagoon remake scripts that I didn't cover when I did that episode last year. Because last year I went and did the Bill Phillips script, which was the version John Carpenter was going to direct, and I think I said in that episode, I'm just doing this one because I really don't feel like reading through those other two again because I didn't like them. Well, this came in second on that Twitter poll I did a while ago. After it came in second to the Suspiria remake, and so I did a couple of episodes between here and there, and I'm circling back around to that poll, and so I'm going to do this one. Now, before I get into the meat of the episode, I just want to get, the usual plugs out of the way. If you want to contact the show with a question or concern, you can always go to screenplayarchaeology at outlook.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Tumblr, Twitter. I shouldn't be that hard to find. The show is available on iTunes, whatever iTunes is going to become in the near future, Spotify, Stitcher Radio, Google Play Music, and I still haven't heard back from Pandora, and you're going to keep hearing that, but if you leave a review, I'm going to keep checking those platforms occasionally for reviews, especially iTunes, because it's easier to find them on iTunes, if I'm being honest. I will read them out on the show, and if there is one on there that's been there fairly recently and I missed it, my bad. But to get into this episode, to give a little bit of background, Creature from the Black Lagoon is it's sort of thought of as the last of the true classic Universal monsters, even if it did come about 10 years after, that whole the big ones finally ended, because around 44-45 is when Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolfman, and the Mummy, they all sort of just ended, and then a couple years later they started doing the Abbott and Costello movies, and the gothic thing kind of started falling out of favor, and science fiction became more of what the popular horror stuff was, and Creature from the Black Lagoon was part of that, but he became so popular and iconic he has become up there with the Frankensteins and the Draculas, so that's interesting to think about. And I want to say it was the first of the Universal monster movies I ever saw as a kid, was that one. We had it taped off a Sci-Fi Channel, I think. And it's really good. To me, it's a movie that still holds up pretty well this day. The monster design is still incredible looking. There's a lot of sort of incredible, iconic moments. Some fun characters mixed in there. Of course, everybody remembers, Kay swimming in the lagoon and the creature swimming up from underneath her. And all in all, it's just still a really, fun movie to watch even now. And the sequel, it's been a while since I've watched the two sequels, but I remember Revenge of the Creature. I remember liking it when I was younger. I haven't seen it in a good long while, but I remember it being pretty decent, even if it was basically just King Kong, only with the Gill Man in it. But who knows if it would hold up for me. I mean, I've even looked at, pictures of what the suit looks like, and they changed the eyes, and they look terrible. But maybe it would still be an okay watch for me. And Creature Walks Among Us, I haven't seen in a very long time, but I remember it being a very odd third movie to the series. I remember it having a lot of just strange directions it went in, like the Gill Man loses his lungs and he becomes he loses his gills, I should say, and his lungs sort of grow, his vestigial lungs take over so he's able to breathe on land more readily. And he's made into a sympathetic victim. And that's compounded by the fact that the main human characters are almost all completely despicable. You have the female lead who's married to this asshole, but she's not particularly likable herself, and she has a lover who's also kind of an asshole. Everybody in the movie is just kind of a jerk, so you don't really care when they get killed off. And there's this whole thing where the lover gets killed by the husband, and he tries to frame the creature for it. And that whole thing is just what the fuck? And then the creature breaks out. It ends on this kind of depressing note. It leaves room for a sequel. But since the series ended there, it's this really depressing kind of ending where he can't, go back to the water because he doesn't have gills anymore and he'll die. And it shows him sitting or standing on the beach, looking at the ocean with this longing expression on his face. And it's left up to you if he lives or if he goes into the ocean and drowns himself. And I'm like, wow, that's a bleak note to end it on. It's just and it's an interesting idea, moving, because there was always a bit of a sympathetic angle to the Creature from the Black Lagoon in that he was just the last of his kind and he was lonely and all that kind of thing. that third movie really emphasizes that to a degree. It's just a shame the rest of the movie around it wasn't as good as, some of those ideas. And of course, the Creature from the Black Lagoon has had, a pop culture presence. Like, the most notable thing that featured him since then was the Monster Squad, where it is a very cool looking design that those guys put together, and he's really cool in the movie. It's just a shame he gets killed by a single shotgun blast, because Creature survives multiple gunshot wounds throughout all the original movies, but it's a shame. And I think really that's about it. He got those 3 movies, and he's the iconography is all over the place. Like Universal has merchandised him to hell and back and all that, but that's not the end of it. But because Universal has been trying to remake the original movie for nearly 40 years now, and I covered some of this in the last episode, so I'm going to blow by it really quickly. There was the John Landis produced 3D remake that they were looking at making in 1982, and he wanted to get Jack Arnold back to direct it. And Nigel Neal wrote a script, which I still have been unable to get my hands on. The only places I've seen it are with, people who have hard copies who don't want to take the time to scan it, or they're at universities who caught on to my bullshit and decided they weren't going to scan it for me either. So yeah, if anybody has a copy of this, please is listening to this show, please take an hour or 2 to scan in the pages and shoot me the PDF. I'll be forever in your debt. But that ended up falling apart because Landis, who was producing, and also Jack Arnold's health became a problem. Joe Dante was on hand to replace him if need be. But, he was insisting on shooting it in 3D like the original was. But Jaws 3D didn't do as well as Universal wanted it to, so they plug. And eventually, it was in the early 90s, the idea of remaking it came back again, and that was the John Carpenter version with the Bill Phillips script, which is what I covered a year ago. Very, very good script, very good read. Definitely go listen to that episode if you want more information, but that fell apart, and I go into all that in that episode. And throughout the 90s, there was all these different things going on. Like, there was a Harrison Weingrod script that I don't know anything about, and no one has it. Supposedly John Landis was attached to direct at one point again. Peter Jackson was offered it, but he turned it down in favor of remaking King Kong, which he eventually did, but much later. And even Ivan Reitman, of all people, was attached. I'm not sure if it was him or the Landis version that was rumored to be an urban comedy, according to some of the things I've read. I forget which it was, but wow, that sounds really stupid. And eventually, things picked up again when Gary Ross, who's the son of the original writer, Arthur A. Ross, interestingly enough, he kind of got some clout in Hollywood because he did a couple of pretty successful movies, namely Pleasantville, which is really good. And he signed on to produce and eventually write, but I'll get to that in a minute, A Creature from the Black Lagoon remake. And, it was supposed to be a big passion project for him because his dad wrote it and it meant a lot to him and stuff like that. And it was a year later, 2002, was when Guillermo del Toro was in talks to direct a remake. And he wanted his version to be a period piece set in the Victorian era. And he also wanted to explore the idea of the creature being successful in its romance, if you can call it that, with the female lead. And it was a combination of things that killed the Del Toro version. I don't think a script was ever fully written even, but Universal didn't care for that second idea, and they probably also didn't want to spend extra money on the period piece setting, I guess that was part of the reason why the Wolfman didn't do as well, because they spent a shitload of money on reshoots, period costumes. But also Del Toro had a shitload of projects on his plate, and as he always does, and so that kind of caused Creature to fall by the wayside as well. And I think he went and did Hellboy after that. And eventually some of his ideas got recycled in The Shape of Water, the Oscar-winning movie. And it is interesting to think about what could have been if a Guillermo del Toro Creature from the Black Lagoon. But if we got the Hellboy movies, the 2 good ones that he did, and The Shape of Water out of it, I'm perfectly okay with the movie not happening. And so things moved on without Del Toro. Gary Ross, kept moving with it, and a new script was written by Teddy Serafian, who has a story credit on Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines. And I glanced at his draft, which is from quite a bit before the movie it came out, actually, and it had a bunch of different stuff in it. I mainly just looked at the ending to see if that really, really good ending scene from the movie came from him, and it actually didn't. So I'd have to actually read through his script and see how much of that movie can be attributed to him, But he was hired in around 2004, and I know he turned in the draft because I've seen it listed on the script trade list, which I haven't managed to get my hands on. But the script I'm going to be covering right now is one solely credited to Gary Ross, and the second one from later on in 2007, which is revised by Breck Eisner. Now, they're basically the same story, and I just want to get into this bit of a complicated thing right now because it's a bit weird, and I just wanted to get it out of the way and address it now, because even though the Gary Ross version is not credited to anybody else, if you look at the Breck Eisner revision, it says by Teddy Serafian, revisions by Paul Shiring and Gary Ross, and it says current revisions by Breck Eisner. So I'm assuming that the Gary Ross draft is those revisions that are listed on there, that he revised the Serafian draft and then Breck Eisner revised him. Well, he revised Shiring's revisions and then Eisner revised his revisions. Now, it's totally possible that Serafian was only credited on that later draft because of, technical reasons, because more often than not, you'll see this happen with different drafts of scripts where the original writers will be credited on it and they'll say revisions, current draft, even though the original writer stuff has been almost completely thrown out. So until I get a look at that Serafian script, I can't possibly know for sure. So I'm just going to assume that Ross revised the Serafian draft in some form, or maybe threw it out and wrote his own. I don't know for sure, but it's one of those two. Now, the plot of these two drafts, it's mostly the same. It differs in details, but the broad outline is the same. It's about this tourist couple named John and Carrie who have this kind of strange relationship. They're going on, they're coming down to, the Amazon, and they're going to stay at this special lodge called the Treetops Lodge, which is basically like this luxury hotel, but it's way up in the canopy of the rainforest. However, they get stranded and get picked up by a research ship called the Daedalus, which is owned by a pharmaceutical company called Jensen Pharmaceuticals. And they basically get stuck on this boat because they can't take them to where they need to go. And they basically decide to stay there and go along with the expedition, which eventually finds its way to the Black Lagoon, which is this strange place which has been cut off, evolutionarily speaking, from the rest of the world. And they discover all these interesting sort of pharmaceutical possibilities there, and regenerative properties and stuff like that. And eventually they also run across the creature who is none too happy about their presence. Now, to move along, the Gary Ross draft is undated, and it's only credited to Gary Ross. There's another person's name way down in the corner, but it doesn't say who they are. They could be a producer. And I'm just going to go right into it. So I'm going to assume this one was around 2004, 2005-ish. And it opens with, you have three unnamed South American men who are operating some sort of dredging machine in the depths of the Amazon. We later find out that they are in fact in the Black Lagoon, and they're all drunk and drinking, and the machine keeps breaking down, and they stop to eat some nasty sounding fish for lunch, and one of them goes to wash his hands in the river and gets pulled in and killed by the unseen creature, leaving only a severed arm behind. The other two panic and start the boat to flee, only for the creature to approach the boat from behind in a point of view shot, and one of the men turns around and sees it and screams. And for an opening sort of horror kill scene, honestly not too bad, and not too far off from the Hazard and whatever that other guy's name was in the opening of the Bill Phillips draft. It's a similar enough concept, and I think it's a good opening scene. And so the scream then match cuts to an opera singer hitting a high note in the Manaus Opera House during a performance of Madame Butterfly. That's a pretty cool editing trick, and I think they cut the black over the title at some point during this. So yeah, that's an interesting sort of audio-visual cue. Stunning visual, as Whiskey Brewer would say. And it's here that we meet the Bradshaws, John and his much younger wife, Carrie. So yes, this main character in this draft is named Carrie Bradshaw. Why the fuck is there a shout out to Sex and the City in this? And I can't even stand Sarah Jessica Parker on a good day. I can't explain why. I just can't stand the woman. But I don't. This script is already kind of annoying enough to read. I don't need to be picturing her during it. And their interactions, they seem a little strained. And they meet and have dinner with an old local couple at this outdoor restaurant, and it's explained that Carrie used to work with some sort of preservation group that was all about protecting the rainforest, and it was her idea to come down here. And it's mentioned that she used to suffer from chronic fatigue syndrome, and that John was her psychiatrist and treated her and helped her get over it. And they're approached during the meal by a native boy who tries to sell them some animals, and he calls Carrie a word that their dinner companion translates as jungle. So we already have this weird setup for this relationship where he was her shrink, she's not his patient anymore, and it's just awkward because they never actually explain what the hell actually was going on there. Her condition gets brought up a couple more times, but there's never any expansion of what actually happened there, how these two ended up together. It's all just it's all just very vague and makes the characters just awkward to read about. And so speaking of awkward, there follows this sex scene between the two where it's like, oh no, Carrie, you look like you're getting fatigued right in the middle of it. And for some reason, the script decides to stop and tell us about the fact that there's like a private zoo in Manaus, Brazil. And it's like, and that like, ooh, like it's like the sounds that are copulating are overlaid over the sounds of the animals. Like, why the fuck? This whole sequence set in Manaus, which goes on for feels like Gary Ross was like reading through his tour guide to Brazil and just had to put all these facts in here talking about like the rubber industry and like the details of the opera house and the zoo, and he decides to fold that into the sex scene. It's like, why? And once again, like she's like, oh, I'm not your patient anymore, blah, blah, blah. And then next day they board a rusty riverboat that's supposed to take them to, the Treetops Lodge. And however, they're on their way and they're the only passengers. So this whole thing seems really sketchy. The riverboat's propeller gets caught on something and the crew insists that they abandon ship to seek help at a village several kilometers away. And then John gets angry and refuses to go, and he uses Carrie's condition as an excuse. And he goes, do you want a relapse? Do you want a repeat of what happened in Portugal? Which we never hear anything more about. And they wait on the boat for the crew to return, and they're just arguing, and John is bitching and whining about everything, and I already hate these characters. Jesus Christ. And they spend the night there, but and the next morning the crew still hasn't come back. And that's when they get picked up by the modern high-tech research ship called the Daedalus, specifically designed for traveling in the Amazon basin. And they say, oh, this boat never touches saltwater unless we're visiting Belém on the coast like once a year. And so they're given a tour by the corporate guy, Morgan Hallowell, he's basically the representative of Jensen Pharmaceuticals on the ship. And he shows them the bridge where they meet Captain Don, the engine room, the lounge, the kitchen where they meet the chef Olivier, and they go to the labs where they meet the scientist Walter, who basically is like a company man as well, and the wine cellar and bar. And this is where they meet Andrew Sims, who's an Australian professor who tells them that the boat is half owned by Hallowell's people and half by Johns Hopkins University. And there's this whole rivalry between these two, which is like basically driving the plot of this thing more than the creature does, in fact. And it's just tedious, really. You'll see. You'll get the idea more as we go along. And there's a bit of a spark between Carrie and Andrew, which seems to annoy John. And they have dinner with the crew that night, where it's like all these people we've seen, and then like a dozen more unnamed crew members, I forget for body count purposes, but the script kind of just loses track of them. And Andrew proposes that they come along for the full expedition instead of just getting off at Iquitos as planned. John isn't happy about this, but Carrie insists on it because, she always wanted to see the rainforest. And so the journey upriver past Iquitos continues into uncharted territory, and also it's set up that Morgan is kind of interested in Carrie as well, which is strange. But they go into uncharted territory, and we get fleetingly introduced to Morgan's assistant Pete, and you could have just made these two guys one character and it wouldn't have made a difference. Dive Master Wayne and Andrew's assistant Chloe. Now there's a brief moment in this where John seems to kind of be flirting with Chloe. So this script has this, which that doesn't go anywhere either. So this script has this weird love pentagon going on where you have John and Carrie are married. Carrie sort of has a thing with Andrew. John kind of has a flirtation with Chloe. Oh wait, it's more of a fucking hexagon now that I think of it, because Morgan is sort of interested in Carrie, but that gets dropped pretty quickly. And then the creature also has kind of an interest in Carrie, which also doesn't really go anywhere. So you have this weird, romantic soap opera entanglement. I'm not really sure what this is all about. But the further they go upriver, the darker the water gets thanks to a certain kind of algae in it. And they eventually arrive at the Black Lagoon, cutting through the dense foliage with diamond saws mounted at the bow to get in and drop anchor. And they're still able to keep in contact with the outside world and log into AOL, much to John's relief. Yes, in 2005, this guy is still excited to get signed into AOL, which especially reading this in 2019, holy shit, did that not age well. Now, thanks to a satellite dish that reaches above the canopy. And Andrew sets up a blimp designed to allow them to go above the canopy, and John actually has to give Carrie permission to go up. And so while Andrew and Carrie are up in the blimp, I should talk about the whole algae thing. I don't really need an explanation for why the Black Lagoon is the Black Lagoon. I can accept that it is just the Black Lagoon. And I want to say the Black Lagoon, it takes them, like, I've gone through the first 40 pages of plot in this thing pretty quickly. I want to say it takes somewhere around there. In fact, let me check the script just to confirm that page count. Yeah, it's like over 30 pages before they get, the diamond, they cut to the Black Lagoon, they saw through it on page like 38, 39, so it takes them 40 pages before we get to the Black Lagoon. That's a little too much. Because the creature is supposed to be the focus, and the fact that we spend so much time on this back and forth with the tourist stuff. Yeah. And so while Andrew and Carrie up in the blimp, they find an unusual patch of new growth leaves, one of which Andrew takes as a sample, and they say that this isn't the growth season, so that's unusual. And then Wayne dives into the lagoon looking for fish for Olivier to cook, because Olivier is the French cook who is the comic relief in this thing who's always bitching about stuff. And I'm like, what? Why did you bring along a fancy French chef on your scientific expedition? Makes no sense, guys. And he's watched by a POV shot as he finds the dredging machine from the opening and gets jump scared by some small fish popping out at him. Joy! The underwater version of a cat scare. And then another POV approaches him from behind and brushes his shoulder, but it turns out to be Chloe sneaking up on him. So the other kind of shitty fake jump scare. Two kinds of shitty fake jump scares within like a page of each other. And so that night, Olivier is preparing the fish for dinner when he finds that one of them is still breathing, despite being speared by Wayne, and they're like, the both of them are like watching as it flips onto the floor and over the side of the boat, and they're like freaking out over it. And so over dinner, the romantic tensions escalate, and I think this is the last time that Morgan's interest in Carrie is at all mentioned in this. And we learned that Andrew has given the tree sample to Walter for observation and analysis. They also hear a loud banging sound against the side of the boat, which subsides, and then leads to a match cut of John and Carrie's headboards hitting the wall as they fuck. What the fuck, script? Walter, Don, and Morgan meet, and we learn here that nothing was found of the cause of the banging sound except for some scratch marks, so if we get rid of that silly match cut to the fucking, then that's actually a pretty decent suspense building technique. But we also find out that they came here to study the properties of the algae in the lagoon, but the why is still a bit fuzzy. Yeah, it's never really clear why in this script they know about this lagoon, or why they know to come to this specific area, how they know about the algae. I don't think that's ever actually explained. The next draft does go into that a little more, but we'll talk about that when we get there. And the next morning, Walter discovers that the leaf has started to regenerate the tree it was taken from. And Morgan wants this kept from Andrew because, he wants to, take it for the company. But Andrew finds out anyways and causes problems when he claims part ownership of the sample. However, it also turns out that the trees they sawed through to get into the lagoon have regrown and tangled up the stern, trapping them there. A team is contacted to come help them, but John is distraught and wants to steal the dinghy and leave. He gets angry and all but blames Carrie for the situation, so John continues to be an unlikable asshole. Carrie continues to be a bland cipher. It all keeps going. And so Andrew and the scientific team, they go to set up observation platforms in the trees. Carrie and John stay behind on the boat, and she decides to do something impulsive and puts on a bathing suit and goes swimming in the lagoon as John watches and shouts at her to stop and come back. And she's watched from below by a mysterious POV as this happens. She eventually gets entwined and dragged under by an anaconda, all while John continues to scream, "Carrie, get back in the boat!" Ugh. The lagoon turns red with blood as Carrie floats to the surface along with the torn-in-half corpse of the anaconda. She swims back to the boat where she argues with John some more as the POV continues to watch her, and she goes like, "It's okay, John, I'm not angry at you." He's like, "But it's not okay!" God fucking damn. You took an iconic moment from the original and just fucked it. I don't understand why these characters are written to be so horribly annoying. My only guess is that Gary Ross, who's not really a horror guy, because he's known for stuff like Pleasantville and Seabiscuit, good movies, not really horror movies in any way. And so I guess maybe he's one of those non-horror people who's under the assumption that horror movies need to be about unlikable people getting horribly killed or something like that. Like, you want to hate these people so that when they die, you're cheering or something like that. And even most slasher movies don't really do that. So yeah, I don't know, but this whole thing of she's being attacked by an anaconda and John just going, "Get out of the water, get back on the boat." Oh, fuck you, John. Seriously. Peter and Morgan confer in the lab, determining that they can get the rights to the discovery so long as they can get a sample, sent to their people before Andrew can get a patent on it. And the leaf has continued to grow, forming even more of the tree it came from. And they, along with a few other crew members, set out during the night with some Indian guides to look for the area the leaf came from, and they pulled the coordinates from the blimp, basically. And there's also some technobabble about the lagoon being isolated and evolving independently like the Galapagos Islands. Now, that's an interesting idea. But do we want to have all this expansion of the lagoon as its own special place at the expense of actually setting up the creature? No, I don't think so. In fact, it takes a long time to get to the creature period in this. We're over an hour into this movie, and we've only gotten a couple of POVs. Like, there's not even that much buildup. And once again, if you cut down on the half hour getting these people to the ship, and introduced to the crew, you could get to, if you got to the creature stuff by 45 minutes in, that's fine. But the fact that it takes you over an hour to really get to him doing anything at all, because we spent half an hour on the tourism bullshit and introducing us to the crew and the ship and all these other situations and talking about the lagoon and exploring and all this. It's just not a very well-paced story. And then on the boat, the carcass of the anaconda with its head missing is found left outside the porthole of John and Carrie's cabin like an off. However, this gets overshadowed by the fact that the mangroves have grown into the boat and taken out the computers, which forces the captain to break the seal. There's this whole thing about how, like, if they're inside the boat, they can be completely isolated from the jungle. It's like hermetically sealed or something like that. And so Captain Don has to break the seal, letting the heat into everywhere except the lab. Like, the lab is the only place getting power. The Indians take Morgan and company to the area where the leaf was found, warning them that the place is dangerous. And these Indians just show up out of nowhere and disappear just as fast. Morgan dismisses this as a superstition, and they explore the area, eventually coming to a rocky outcrop. A crew member named Ramon, who we literally just meet and get a name for now, discovers a hidden cave where he comes face to face with the creature in the beam of his flashlight. Cuts Ramon's chest and then pursues him as he runs out of the cave, blending into the foliage with natural camouflage, so it's kind of like a chameleon in this version. He climbs up a tree to get away from it, getting poisoned to death by tree frogs. Yes, really. The creature doesn't kill this guy, the poison dart tree frogs kill him. Now, I know the rainforest is an incredibly dangerous place, but in your monster movie, maybe let the first member of the crew to die be killed by the monster, not by a frog. And then Morgan and the rest of the group find his body sometime later, now with a broken neck and bite marks on his throat. So yeah, the creature doesn't kill it, it just waits for him to die, and it's slightly implied that he specifically chased it up this tree, but it really doesn't read like that. It reads more like it just saw him climb up the tree and went, oh yeah, there's poison frogs up there, let him die. And so they bring the body back to the ship to have Walter perform an autopsy on it. Andrew confronts them about his treetop lab getting trashed, which my eyes must have glazed over or something, because I don't remember there being a scene establishing that. But he backs down when Morgan tells him about what happened to Ramon. And the rainforest continues to encroach on the interior of the boat, like vines start growing everywhere and stuff like that. And Carrie seems to start thriving in this new environment, while John continues to fall apart. And he tries to enact his plan to leave, even getting Wayne to let him hook his laptop up to the mini-sub's batteries so that he can send emails out, and upset when Carrie wants to move out to the treetop platform with Andrew, and even tries to keep her from leaving, but this is where their relationship just dies completely. Then Walter makes a new discovery, finding that Ramon's bite wounds have healed even after death, and he speculates that whatever bit him must have caused the healing, and saying that, like, the saliva must have bonded with his DNA. And this gets them to check Ramon's digital camera, finding a shot of the creature. Walter connects this to the native legends about a monster that walks on land and swims like a fish, and Wayne makes the connection to the weird fish from earlier. Walter theorizes that the fish is the younger, tadpole-like form of the creature's species. Based on this new information, Morgan decides to go hunting for another tadpole. And so Carrie, she heads out to the tree station and starts growing closer with Andrew. And they're actually on like two different platforms. She's on one, he's on another. And I swear Chloe just disappears after this scene. Once again, I must have missed something. And so Morgan leads the hunting trip outfitted in advanced diving suits. They manage to capture a young creature that's now developed into a bigger, more serpent-like form before the adult attacks. The creature decapitates a man named Dwayne, who I swear we just meet in this scene, and causes Peter and another guy named Pablo to drown when their suits are destroyed. Wayne manages to subdue the creature with a taser, and he and Morgan escape with their quarry. Now that's actually a pretty good monster action scene where it's attacking them under the water. I think that's a pretty well done sequence. I wish we had more of that and less of all the other bullshit, but it is what it is. Okay, and so Carrie settles in for the night in the tree station. The group on the boat studies the serpent creature, which has tripled in size. And there's this hilarious moment where John bursts into the room acting like a crazy person, rambling about all the dead people, and the serpent creature like, specifically looks at him and, like, growls and goes, "What the hell is that?" Which made me laugh. Like, even the monster hates John. Like, he probably hates him as much as I do. And so, in the morning, Wayne finds that the young creature's tail is all that's left in the tank, and Walter speculates that the tadpole is metamorphosed into a new form. Okay, and so we see that it has changed into a small version of the adult creature, and it kills Olivier when it ambushes him in the pantry. Then the rest of the group, they find his corpse, and they split up to go hunting the young creature. Wayne checks the pantry, where he gets spooked by a monkey and fires his gun, and the bullets ricochet, and one of them hits him in the fucking leg. So this guy's a fucking idiot. And there's actually a scene where like one of the characters is like, "I don't know how to use a gun," and they give it to him anyways. So stupidity in a horror movie, nothing new. And then the young creature attacks him as he's walking away and knocking him down some stairs and severely wounding him before Morgan shows up and fills both of them with bullets. Goes like, "Hey, he was dead anyways." So bye, Wayne. And Carrie wakes up in her tree station to find the adult creature watching her. She screams and tries to swing over to Andrew, but gets stuck between stations. Andrew swings over and manages to catch her rope before the creature gets to her, but their weight is too much for the tree branch, which snaps. They fall to the ground, where they're met by a native who takes them back to the ship in a canoe. This is where I have to address the creature's interest in Carrie. That scene of him looking at her as she's laying there and not doing anything is the last time that comes up. Now, in the original, it was very clearly meant to be a romantic, maybe sexual interest on the creature's part. And it was that in the Bill Phillips script as well. Here, like, he shows some interest in her, he watches her from the water, he saves her from the anaconda and then leaves its corpse outside her window as like an offering. But then we go off on this sidetrack about its offspring, and there's this whole line about how maybe it was the only one there was. And so that becomes its motivation, that they captured and then killed its child. And so the whole thing about him being interested in Carrie just completely goes away, and he still tries to kill her too. So why is this whole side story about the creature having an interest in her even in this thing, if we're not going to do anything with it? If it's just going to be, it's just there seemingly because it's in the original. Nothing actually comes of it. It would be better off if they just did away with that and went along with their different idea of the offspring. It would save some page time too. Save some running time. So yeah, there's the random convenient Native American guy as well. So back at the ship, Andrew wants to leave, but Morgan has insisted on jury-rigging the solar panels to give Walter enough power to run a DNA scan on the creature's corpse, the young creature. John, meanwhile, has sent out a lot of emails, and he says, "I sent 100 emails." Like, this guy is insistent that, like, the best chance for rescue is him to stay right there and wait for someone to respond to one of his rescue emails. Like, this guy is just hilariously stupid at this point. So yeah, John is still annoying and unlikable, and I still hate him, but he's at least funny now. And Morgan, not wanting Andrew to make it back to civilization and get a patent before he does, has Don scuttle the launch, stranding everyone there, so Morgan is just a complete cartoon bad guy at this point. And discovering this, Andrew and Carrie work on getting all the windows closed in an effort to keep the adult creature out when it inevitably comes for revenge for the death of its offspring. And this is when Andrew's like, "Oh hey, that's probably the only child it had. It probably only ever reproduces once, so I guess it reproduces asexually, which makes its interest in Carrie seem weird too." That doesn't really fit in either. And so, so Andrew, Carrie, and John end up pulling up inside like the observation deck, which is at the top of the ship and has like a glass bubble over it. Walter begins the scan of the corpse, saying it should take 6 hours to complete, and while Carrie, John, and Andrew in the observation deck, Walter and Morgan continue the analysis, and the corpse has been sliced into all these segments that are scattered all over the lab. And then the creature attacks the ship, it decapitates Don, and while Morgan is talking to the Brazilian crew member who found his body, the creature enters the lab, and that crew member, by the way, completely disappears without a trace. So you have unnamed crew member and Chloe are still somewhere around at the end of this script, and we never catch up with them unless I missed Chloe's death. So the creature enters the lab, finding its child's head and cradling it, which is honestly a really nice moment. And then it just goes crazy and starts destroying the lab and like cuts Walter's throat with one swipe of its claws, and then chases down Morgan and starts hugging him to death. And there's this moment where their faces are reflected in a porthole that's like, who's the real monster? And I'm like, the monster that's hugging a guy to death right now. Maybe he's the real monster. So yeah, kind of an interesting moment, but not that great. And so the three up in the observation deck, they hear the attack as it happens, and John pulls out this emergency tracker, which he apparently has had this whole time and never thought to mention it, and turns it on. However, the radio signal angers the creature and begins to lead it right to them, so they have to turn it off. Then Andrew forms a plan where he's like, hey, we can use that blimp to get out. I don't know why they didn't think of that like 6 hours earlier, but whatever. And so he's like, but of course John is against it. He's like, I want to stay right here. My 100 emails are definitely going to work. They open the window and they put the tracker right next to it, turning it on to lead the creature away from the door. And they flee to the blimp just as the creature crashes through the window. Oh, and I should mention the young creature losing its tail. It's interesting that it says that here because all the concept sculptures that I think it was ADI made for this, the creature still has a tail. So I'm guessing that was a concept that was deleted by the time, Breck Eisner was supposed to direct. In fact, that's not even in the Eisner revision, so I don't even know why I'm bothering mentioning that. And so they get to the blimp and fill it up, and John is refusing to get in, insisting that his 100 emails will bring a rescue team as long as they wait. He tries to get in at the last minute, but the creature grabs his leg and he falls into the water. He survives, and Carrie drops a line to him, but he's not strong enough to climb it, saying he's a doctor, not an athlete. Damn it, Jim. Sorry, can't resist. This forces them to lower the blimp, and Carrie manages to help him in, but the creature grabs onto the bottom, keeping it from lifting off. It eventually lets go, though, and the three of them fly to safety, and it ends. So this whole love triangle thing, it does not go anywhere. The creature's interest disappears after a certain point in the script. Morgan's interest disappears. The whole flirtation with Chloe, nothing happens there. And the actual, thing she seems to have with Andrew doesn't get much time to develop because the creature attacks happen, and then John doesn't die and they escape together, so this never gets resolved. And that's literally the ending of this script, is they just get into the blimp and fly away and the creature stays in the lagoon. God, this script is annoying. I hates it, Precious. I hates it. Yeah, I don't know what Gary Ross was thinking with this, just the characters are horribly annoying. It's boring for the most part. There's this tedious rivalry between the corporate guys and the scientists, and it just goes to such an extreme level where it's like people are literally dying and you're more interested in your goddamn patents. No human being on Earth is going to do that. There's a fucking lizard man trying to kill you. You're not going to stay there for 6 hours. And it's not at all really what I want to see from a Creature from the Black Lagoon remake. Now, moving on. Eventually, Gary Ross was still signed on to produce, and they were still trying to get this made. And eventually, they signed on Breck Eisner to direct, who had done Sahara and a few other things. He was Michael Eisner's son. And so they bring him on to direct, and he does a revision of the script, which is dated March 9th, 2007. And this one follows the same basic plot with a lot of differences, so I'm going to have to go through the whole script anyways. And so this one opens with a man described as wearing Peruvian tribal dress with tattoos, but he looks like a European, and he also has these odd reptilian eyelids, running through the Amazon rainforest, pursued by an unseen roaring thing. He leaps over a chasm with superhuman agility and runs onto a highway where he's hit and killed by a pickup truck. This is witnessed by other members of the tribe, but they back off and melt into the jungle when they see that he's dead. And as the body seems to spasm and reanimate, it cuts to the title screen. We then meet John and Carrie. In this draft, they're only engaged, and their plane lands in Iquitos, Peru, instead of starting with them in Manaus. They wander through a street festival celebrating the Feast of San Juan, where a local dressed as the spirit of the forest beckons to Carrie as part of the proceeding, which is foreshadowing for later. John, for his part, seems more interested in his BlackBerry TM. Yeah, there's this random, advertisement for a BlackBerry here, where she's like, can't you live in the moment? He's like, can my BlackBerry be part of the moment? And I have to mention, they're still a little bit awkward together, but John in this draft is actually humanized a lot more and is way less annoying. Also, their last name is not specified as Bradshaw, so thank fuck for that. Pardon me, some congestion. And so we get another sex scene with them, but it's not nearly as awkward. And then the next day, John and Carrie board a riverboat to the Treetops Lodge, where this time, this is where they meet the couple. It's a French couple, and we're getting off at a different resort that's, closer by. And they talk over drinks, and we learn here that John is an incredibly gifted surgeon, and that Carrie was once his patient, and he saved her life, and that's how they met. So even though it's still weird, there's not the whole weird chronic fatigue syndrome thing, which is never expanded on. And he doesn't, use her condition as an excuse for shit. She doesn't have that problem here. So that's gone, thankfully. So immediately these characters are far more tolerable. And we learned that, he was speaking at a conference in Buenos Aires, and he agreed to Carrie's idea to extend the trip for a bit so they could visit the rainforest. And so the French couple disembarks the next day, leaving them as the only passengers. And we get the thing with the propeller getting bent, but here a crew member stays behind with them while the rest of them go to that village. But during the night, he steals all their money and stuff and their passports, and he abandons the ship. And they drift away from shore, and they get stuck on something. And this is where they bump into the Daedalus, and there's not as much time in between these two things as there was in the other one. Like, they aren't arguing on this thing before the Daedalus shows up. And the Daedalus tries to dislodge the riverboat, but it starts to sink, forcing Carrie and John to move over to the new ship. And there's this whole running thing with their engagement ring, where John doesn't want her to publicly wear it because he's afraid she might get mugged. And then they lose everything when the boat sinks except for the ring, which she kept on her finger. And that comes back later. So they have to move over to the Daedalus, and Morgan is introduced here, and he gives them the tour again. And there's some differences. They meet Captain Vieira, who's a Brazilian man here, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right, and his first mate Tomas, as well as the dive team, who is a married couple named Ty and Chloe. And they also meet the research assistant Walter and the medic named Copley, and it's the same scene in the lab where we get similar dialogue about Walter not having a window, but the dialogue is split up between the two characters. And then Morgan informs them that they'll have to stay on the ship for at least 2 weeks as there are no nearby towns and that they can't call in the seaplane due to security concerns. John isn't happy about this, but Carrie convinces him that it's a good idea to stay. That night at dinner, they meet the rest of the crew, Blaylock and Beck, who are the security team. Andrew is the native Peruvian guide who also has like a doctorate and stuff. Wayne is Andrew's assistant, and Ramon is the engineer. And there is no thing about there being different factions or any kind of rivalry. They're all technically working for the pharmaceutical company here, so that whole tedious, filler crap is not present. Carrie and Andrew, they have a moment when he shows her the Amazon River dolphins through some underwater observation windows. And he also tells her a native story about how the spirits of drowning victims enter the dolphins and become young men again, which I believe was also recounted in the Phillips script. Later, Morgan, the security team, Andrew, and Wayne take off into the flooded jungle on Zodiacs, not saying where they are going or what they are doing. So yeah, this is one of the first major differences between the two. While Morgan's team is gone, John and Carrie learn from Ty and Chloe that even they don't know what the expedition is after, and that Morgan is keeping everyone in the dark about it. And later, Carrie spots Walter next to a human corpse under a sheet, but he notices her and she has to leave before she can see more. You're already probably guessing that's the body from the beginning, and it is. The team in the jungle finds an empty village it's empty except for like a wild boar that's kept in the pen. And they find a tree carved with a crude map pointing to a black circled up river described as the source of life. As you can guess, that's the Black Lagoon. Back at the boat, Carrie goes diving with Ty and Chloe. She gets jump scared by an arapaima fish, so we got that lazy ass thing in there again. And when she comes up and she's drying off on the deck, and a group of natives in canoes have approached. They're the ones from the village, and one of them, with those same weird eyelids, tries to burn the ship, but he's shot and killed by Vieira, and the rest of the natives flee with his body, and there's not too much damage done. Morgan and his team return to the ship, and despite the attack, he insists on continuing upriver. John tries to get him to turn around, but Morgan responds with a threat. That's when Carrie confronts him about the cadaver Walter was working on, and Morgan gives in and decides to tell them all about what's going on. He tells them the story of the Rita, a boat that went up the Amazon in 1899 looking for gold, captained by one Valdemar Schultz, and disappeared along with his crew. That is until 2008, when one of them, Arthur McMorrow, turned up and got hit by a truck. So he was the guy in the opening, and he was very, very young despite being over 100 years old. Walter shows them the body and explains that they found several mutations in it, and they determined where in the jungle the tribe must be located by examining, the components of his tattoos, because it matches up to certain, silts or something like that. And they think that the crew of the Rita found some way to extend their lives and integrate with the tribe. And they also mentioned that the markings, tied them into this story about a tribe of all men who hunt jaguars in the jungle that were considered a legend until now. And Jensen Pharmaceuticals wants to discover and manufacture whatever causes, whatever allows them to stay young and regenerate and stuff like that. So yeah, we actually get an explanation of how they know about the Black Lagoon and what they want from it in this. Now, granted, them going off into the jungle like that does kind of drag the story out a little bit more, like the last draft, but at least here, it's building some interesting stuff, some new mythology. It's not just dragged out on bullshit. And once again, you could get them onto the research ship in a much different fashion, and this would be, and it would be shorter and much better because of it. So yeah, they definitely need to get rid of that whole riverboat thing. That's what drags it down. But so far, this revision, much better than the Gary Ross draft. It's still not great, and it's still not exactly what I want to see from a Creature from the Black Lagoon movie because there's not enough focus on the creature, but it's still, it actually reads a lot better and feels like it would be a bit of a decent monster movie in a way. As they continue upriver, Carrie starts to have second thoughts, but John is enraptured by the possibilities the research presents and wants to stick with it. So these two have sort of switched places. John, the doctor, sees the medical possibilities for this, and, it makes sense that he would want to take part in something like this. Now Carrie is the one who wants to go back, so there isn't any stupid arguing between the two about how she wants to go, about how it was her fault. The characters are humanized here. They come to the end of a tributary, which is blocked by trees, and the crew cuts through them with chainsaws by hand, working through the night, so there's no giant saw in the front of the boat here. The ship emerges through the path they cut into the Black Lagoon, which once again is colored that way because of algae. The team splits up into 3 groups: underwater, ground, which includes John and Morgan, and air balloon, which is Andrew and Carrie. The ground team discovers a new species of flower, which Walter takes a sample from. The 3 teams, they bring back all kinds of plant and animal specimens, many of which are entirely new. Like, they find the corpse of a butterfly with, like, a long wingspan, and they find this big-ass mosquito that's dead, and they have all these different kinds of animal specimens. That night at dinner, John gets angry at Carrie for being gone for a very long time, and she ends up swimming in the lagoon, where she thinks she catches a glimpse of something in the water below her before Ty approaches and, scares her, thinking she was Chloe. So, dumb jump scare, but whatever. And in the lab, Walter discovers that plant samples have grown exponentially and killed many of the animals, and also a bunch of them have escaped, including some ants. And the dead mosquito, which had its wings pinned to like a specimen thing, has, ripped off and regrown its wings. Okay, where am I in the notes? Yeah, it has regenerated and come back to life and actually have to deal with it again. And he shows all this to Morgan, who is skeptical at first, but Walter seems to convince him. They then get a call from communications, and they're talking to Ty via like a communicator, and he's showing them via dive cam that the steel specimen nets in the water have been torn open by something, and they then check Chloe's camera and they see the wreck of an old ship. On the dead list, Carrie describes what she saw to Morgan, saying it was too short of a glimpse to be sure, but that it was like a crocodile, only bigger. Ty and Chloe approach the wreck, and they note the name Rita on the side, and after a 6-foot catfish jump scares them, so yay, that again. They explore inside it. They find a jagged hole in the hull, barrels of cyanide, which they say were used for gold mining. I'm not sure how exactly. I'm not familiar with that practice. And deep within, they find the entrance to an underwater cave. They explore the narrow tunnel, which opens up into a wider space, and then they surface inside a massive limestone cave that they call a cenote or a cenote, which is a word which came up in the Uncharted script as well, which opens out onto the jungle, and it's also filled with a large amount of bones. They send their coordinates via GPS and then head back to the ship. That night, Carrie gets attacked by wasps, which were among the escaped specimens. And after Morgan has cleared them out, Andrew takes Carrie to Viera, who shows them the previous night's fish finder data, and shows a much larger than usual blip which circles the ship at 2-hour intervals. And it's then that the power starts to flicker, and it turns out that the ship's underwater intake vent has been blocked, and that they'll lose power completely if it isn't cleared. So yeah, I like the build up here with the creature. There's the torn open nets, and then the fish finder data. I think that's pretty good build up. I just wish we could have gotten to it a little bit quicker. And so Morgan sends Ty and Chloe to take care of it against Andrew's advice, who thinks that sending them out at night is too dangerous. And Morgan actually agrees. He says, I don't want to send them out there either, but, we have to do this, or, the lab is going to get, the power. We're going to lose all of the things we worked for the last couple days. So Morgan here is more of a human being. And so he has them turn on these bright lights on the ship's bottom, so that's all lit up. And they find an underwater vine has seemingly reached up and plugged itself into the valve. And so Ty has to use a blowtorch to take the vent cover off, and then begins cleaning it out. When Carrie notices a large blip approaching on the fish finder, she says that we have to get them out of the water. But right as that happens, more vines get sucked in, and the power goes out completely. And both Carrie and Morgan are running out to the deck, screaming at the water, saying, get out of the water, get out of the water. So even Morgan is concerned about his people here, unlike in the last draft where he didn't give a shit. He comes off like a flawed human being, but a human being here as opposed to the cartoon character he was there. And so Ty adds Chloe to torch, saying, if something attacks us, hit it. And something starts swimming around them, and it comes off like it accidentally, bumps into the torch. And so Chloe gets grabbed, and she gets slammed into the underwater observation windows as Carrie watches, because Carrie went down to the windows and Morgan went up to the deck. And she sees her get just smashed up against it, and she gets a glimpse of the creature's face in the process, which is a kind of a cool reveal, because it's like in the middle of the dark, swirling, bloody water in the middle of the torchlight. Pretty cool visual idea. Stunning visual. It backs off and leaves, and Ty manages to grab Chloe and throw her onto the ship, following closely behind. And so Chloe is rushed to the dining room where she's laid on a table as John attempts to operate on her. Carrie has to assist as Copley is nowhere to be found, but it all turns out to be for naught as her wounds are too serious, and it says like her torso has been cut open and her organs are actually visible, like ugh. So this is definitely an R-rated script. And so Chloe dies on the table, and Ty is overcome with anger and almost heads back into the water before Carrie manages to talk him down. And so they store Chloe's body in the walk-in freezer for the night. Now, I really, really like this scene because it does a good job, because you get enough personality from Ty and Chloe in their earlier scenes. Like, you get an idea of they're not deep characters particularly, but you get an idea of their relationship to one another and their sort of chemistry as a couple. So that when she dies, you feel really bad for this character, whereas in the last script, it was like all these characters were just kind of one note and bland. Like, you actually feel something for this character, and when John is trying to operate on her and just fails and he's screaming, you kind of feel bad for John, which I never felt in the other draft. I just want him to go away. Like, here he's humanized to the point where it just, you really do kind of sympathize with him a little bit. And you feel bad for Carrie too. You understand the relationship isn't great, but you don't hate John the way you do in the last one. And Ty's like reaction where he's about to just go for vengeance, that's really good as well. I really like this section of the script. And so Andrew wants Morgan to immediately call for help on the satellite phone. The rest of their communications have gotten knocked out when their communications mast. The communications mast got taken out when they entered the lagoon. But Morgan insists on saying, like, oh, we're going to wait till tomorrow to do it. And so Andrew goes and he breaks into Morgan's office and uses the satellite phone to call on the plane anyways, and then tosses it overboard so Morgan can't call back and cancel. So yeah, Morgan's moving more towards his antagonistic mode here, but he still feels like a person. It's around now that Walter goes to check on Copley in his cabin, discovering he's been swarmed and eaten by the escaped ants. And some drop from the ceiling onto Walter and start eating him, and he jumps into the lagoon and dies. And so it's now they begin debating about whether or not to stay on the ship, with Andrew suggesting they set up a tree station, because like when Carrie and Andrew went up in the balloon earlier, he set up a net among the trees and they were walking around on it, and he wants to do that basically. And so Carrie, Blaylock, and Wayne go with, and everybody else stays behind, including John, who thinks that that's too risky. You know, there's too many variables in the jungle, as they say. And then the creature, and this is where their relationship truly fully splits, where he says, "You're too." It's like, "What about me? Don't you want to be with me?" And he says, "Well, I guess you're more variable than I thought you were." And the creature's eyes are shown watching the blimp as it leaves the ship. They're shown from underwater. And they go and settle in on the big net. Well, back on the dead list, the group hears a thumping sound and decide to hunt it, thinking it's the creature. And they trace the sound to the freezer, where the threshing, semi-reanimated corpse of Chloe is what's been making the noise. And Ty just loses his mind here. Really creepy moment. And so in the tree station, the blimp gets blown away by the storm. And that's when Andrew notices the creature approaching from below. And they head for the safety lines. Blaylock gets yanked down to his death. That's one thing I like about this draft, is that all the crew members have names, so you can remember kind of who they were, at least a little bit, instead of just being random crew member dead. Carrie begins descending the line when she comes face to face with Blaylock's hanging corpse. And then the creature, which has camouflaged itself while climbing the tree. And there's a moment we're just looking at each other. And then Carrie begins a quick descent to get away from the pursuing creature. But she loses control and crashes through the branches to the ground, ending up with a branch stuck right through her chest. So one of the ways Lara Croft can die if you're not careful with the QuickTime events in the Tomb Raider reboot. The creature approaches and seems to begin to empathize with her a little bit as she's laying there bleeding, but then Wayne makes it to the ground and then shoots at it and gets eviscerated for his troubles, and then the creature leaves. Andrew makes it to the ground and he tries in vain to help Carrie, and that's when they are approached by a group of natives led by a very much alive Valdemar Schultz. Ooh, interesting twist that we kind of could have seen coming, but okay. And so on the ship, John and Morgan begin to perform an autopsy on the still sort of reanimated Chloe, which is freaky. Ty has to be sedated, as he was already losing his mind, and Viera won't participate, finding it morally repugnant. Back in the jungle, Andrew and the wounded Carrie are led to a ceremonial center, and there's all these like wooden carvings of the creature around it. And she gets laid on a slab, and the boar is brought in, and it's left to lure the creature in, and it slaughters and eats the boar, and the blood and its saliva mixed in it are channeled over to the slab, where after the creature leaves, the natives gather it up and feed it to Carrie. Back on the ship, John describes the results of the autopsy, saying that the regeneration was similar to the effects of stem cells, and that they must have come from the creature's saliva, and that this would make it the source of this immortality thing that they're looking for. So similar ideas to the original draft, but more fleshed out. Carrie awakes in the hut in pain with her wounds healed. Schultz explains to her and Andrew that the natives there were Incans who fled the Spanish and that they all worshipped the creature as a god. They want Carrie to stay with them, and they tell her that if she wants to stay immortal, she has to keep taking the blood, and that eventually, the idea you get is that eventually you become more and more like the creature, you get the eyelids and stuff like that. But it's not terribly clear. But she wants nothing to do with it, and so Schultz allows them to leave, provided they make sure that no one retraces their steps. There is also some philosophizing about how the creature is a dark reflection of the human heart and is monstrous to the ones inflamed with greed, which frankly is a bunch of bullshit because Chloe didn't do shit. But that's that. And so yeah, this is some interesting kind of world building with this native tribe about how they basically, live off the creature and make themselves immortal, and they live in the jungle and stuff like that. Like, it's an interesting idea. I wish they could have gone a little more somewhere with it and maybe got to this point a little sooner, but it is what it is. But that whole thing about like, oh, he's only evil to you because you're in his territory and you're greedy and blah, blah, blah. Like, okay, stop it. That's stupid. And so Carrie and Andrew, they go back to the Daedalus, paddling up in a native canoe, and they find Chloe's dissective corpse and Vieira and Tomas tied up in the freezer, who say they tried to stop Morgan from going after the creature. And so we cut to Morgan, John, Ty, Ramon, and Beck, who are in the cenote, planning to dump a barrel of the cyanide from the Rita into the water to subdue the creature. Andrew and Carrie arrive on the scene, and Carrie manages to talk Ty out of dumping the barrel, only for John to do it instead. So Ty gets a bit of a redemption here. I like that. The creature, its movement being tracked by a device called a Hawkeye, and I'm just imagining them dumping a tiny Jeremy Renner into the water, isn't affected by the cyanide and jumps out of the water, and it kills Ramon and Beck. Morgan and John climb up the ropes and flee, but Andrew and Carrie can't because the creature is between them and the ropes. And so Ty says, okay, over here in the water leading to the tunnel out into the lagoon, it's away from where we dumped the cyanide, so I guess there's like a deeper part of the water that we didn't get to see what was down there. I guess it's a shame we didn't get to see the full creature layer, but whatever. He says, hey, we're going to go through the tunnel, and we got this rebreather device that we're going to share between us as we swim through this tunnel. And they're going down there, but he gets dragged away and killed, and the air tanks get taken too. And so Carrie and Andrew are swimming, and they open up an air pocket and take a breath and dive down, but they can't find any more, and they're running out of air. But Carrie's able to hold her breath for longer because of, the creature's saliva and the blood that she drank, and she manages to get Andrew safely back to the ship. She confronts Morgan and John about what happened, but the ship gets attacked by the creature, who tears a hole in the hull, and it begins to sink. They attempt to flee in the Zodiac, but the creature gets there first and kills Tomas before the remaining survivors lock themselves inside the bridge, so we're moving into the climax now. The creature crashes through the window into the bridge, and the remaining survivors scatter in different directions. Carrie and John head for the dive room, and the ship tilts over in the water, so the walls become the floors, basically. John gets dragged off and killed by the creature, and as he's getting dragged off, he yanks his hand as he's trying to hold on to her, pulls off her engagement ring, and it sinks down below. So that's a nice little stunning visual that they've carried across. A nice little thematic thing that's been developed across the script. So he dies here, so that plot point actually gets resolved in this draft, unlike in the other one. The creature, I misread that, hold on. And she then, goes to the dive room where she meets with Vieira as the creature enters, and he has her go down into a hatch that's on what's now the floor, and closes it behind her. And while they're talking, he points out that the creature is bleeding, so they know that, it can be killed. He actually goes, it bleeds, and I'm like, doing my best Arnold impersonation. If it bleeds, we can kill it. That was not the best I can do. But he attacks it with a spear gun, stabbing it, but he gets killed, and he's described as getting crushed in the creature's grip. So he kind of gets the hug death, but not as ridiculous. But he gets killed in the process. So Carrie is stuck inside the flooded part of the script, is banging on the ceiling to catch someone's attention, and she's screaming and stuff, and then Andrew and Morgan, who are getting weapons from the captain's quarters, they hear her pounding on what's now the floor, and Morgan just runs out there with a machine gun while Andrew uses a blowtorch to start cutting a hole in the floor. And so Carrie's down there, she backs away from the blowtorch, she runs into the creature who is wounded and bleeding, and he seems to be kind of backing off from attacking her. There is no interest in her in this script like there is in the others, so it's not really relying on... So once again, it cut out the pointless references to the originals, kind of just doing its own thing here. But it seems to empathize with her in a certain way because they've both been wounded, and it doesn't seem to want to attack her particularly at this point. This could be a little bit more developed, admittedly. But then Morgan shows up, and he fires the machine gun, riddling the creature with bullets, and then eviscerates, and they both fall down and die right next to each other in kind of a Western gun duel kind of way. And so Andrew and Carrie, they get back together, they swim out of the sinking ship, and then the plane finally shows up and picks them up. And he says, hey, I thought you said something about there being a ship. He's like, I guess I was wrong. And they fly away, and the last shot is of the water that's still, and so maybe it's implying that there could still be something down there. But that's where it ends. So yeah, this script, I have to give it to Breck Eisner. I mean, I'm still not a huge fan of this version of the story, but he made it far more tolerable and a better read than the Gary Ross version was. Now, I remember reading this a while ago and liking it a lot less, but I think reading it, in such close proximity to Gary Ross's draft made it much more tolerable, much more interesting, and it would have been a much more decent movie, I think. Once again, it's not exactly what I want to see from a Creature from the Black Lagoon movie, but it's a fairly decent read. Now, what threw this off is that, now I should say that around the time this draft was written, Gary Ross made a comment about how, in our new version, the creature will be created by a pharmaceutical company polluting the Amazon, and that's not evident in any of the scripts. Maybe it was an idea they toyed around with and decided not to go with, but I don't really like that idea either, so I'm glad it's not here. But pretty much what happened with the Breck Eisner version is that they wanted to keep, fiddling with the script before they went into production, and but the writer's strike happened, which delayed it, so Eisner went and focused on doing the Crazies remake, which I haven't seen that, but I've heard good things about it. And then after that, he wanted to get back to this, and he wanted to actually film on location in the Amazon, which I applaud him for that, because that's a really interesting idea. But it just eventually just fell apart, and eventually, there was ideas of, Carl Eric Rinch, who was supposed to do Prometheus when it was still Alien Engineers. He was supposed to do it, but then that fell apart. And then 2012, there was another writer attached who was David Kajanic, who recently wrote the Suspiria remake, and he's written some stuff I've covered on this channel before. He wrote the It script I covered 2 years ago, and I want to get around to doing some more of his stuff, sometime in the future. And around that time, it was rumored that they were going to be retitling the movie The Black Lagoon to separate it from the original. And it sounds like they're kind of moving in that direction with these scripts, with all the focus on how weird and different the area around the Black Lagoon is. And, building all that mythology around it. So it seems like that's a natural progression from these drafts. That never happened. And then, the last we really heard anything about this was around 2015. There was Jeff Pinkner was supposed to write it, and then there was talks about Scarlett Johansson maybe starring in it, but that didn't go anywhere. And then apparently Will Beall, rewrote the Pinkner version, and it was supposed to be tying into the Dark Universe. But then The Mummy came out and flopped, and that basically killed the Dark Universe as it stood at that point. And now we're in this weird limbo where Universal is now working with Blumhouse, and we'll see how that goes with The Invisible Man in 2020. And then maybe they'll resurrect the idea of the Creature remake and actually get it off the ground then. But yeah, that was the remaining Creature from the Black Lagoon drafts. The Gary Ross draft is absolutely fucking horrendous, aside from a couple of moments, and I just cannot stand it. It's so annoying and boring. And the Breck Eisner version, like I said, it's still not what I want to see from a Creature from the Black Lagoon movie, but it's much better, and it would have been at least a tolerable movie to watch. So yeah, that's Creature from the Black Lagoon. I hope you guys enjoyed this, catching up on the Creature from the Black Lagoon remake stuff, which I was, putting off doing for so long. And I hope you enjoyed it. And once again, check us out on Facebook, Tumblr, Twitter, and all that. And until next time, guys, bye.